A flight attendant dumped a glass of ice water onto a black boy's lap and barked, "First class isn't for everyone, kid." The boy didn't move. He sat there, dripping, silent, clutching an old laptop as whispers and laughter rippled through the cabin. Around him, luxury pressed in from all sides. Polished shoes, gold watches, silk scarves, and cold, judging eyes. No one asked if he was okay. No one questioned the cruelty. They had already decided he didn't belong here. To them, he was just a mistake, a face that clashed with their perfect world. They thought embarrassing him would keep the boundaries clear. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know the boy sitting quietly before them had already changed the future in ways they couldn't imagine. And they didn't realize that within minutes, their world would be turned upside down. Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and which moment strikes you the most? The terminal buzzed with its usual symphony of rolling suitcases, distant boarding calls, and hurried footsteps. Bright morning light spilled through the massive windows, casting long reflections on the polished floors. Among the crowd stood a young boy, Ethan Walker, his small frame wrapped in a worn-out jacket that hung loosely on his shoulders. His sneakers were scuffed, his jeans a little too short at the ankles, and his backpack looked like it had seen far better days. Yet there was a determined sparkle in his eyes, a quiet focus that seemed to set him apart from the busy swarm around him. Ethan clutched his boarding pass tightly, his fingers trembling slightly not from fear, but from the overwhelming sensation of being so close to something he had worked for his entire life. He took a deep breath and stepped into the line designated for first-class passengers. Heads turned. Whispers began to ripple through the queue. A woman in an expensive-looking coat wrinkled her nose and shifted her designer purse closer to her body. A businessman in a tailored suit gave Ethan a once-over and then leaned toward the flight attendant stationed at the gate, his voice low but dripping with disdain. "You might want to check that kid's ticket. Looks like he got lost on his way to the economy." The attendant, a woman named Linda Foster, flashed a tight professional smile. She bent slightly over her monitor, pretending to check something, but her eyes, sharp and judging, were locked on Ethan. When it was finally his turn, Ethan offered his boarding pass with both hands, as if presenting something sacred. Linda barely glanced at it before her eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. "First class, huh?" she said, her voice syrupy sweet, but the edge underneath was unmistakable. "We're running a full cabin today, sweetheart. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his chin high. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly but clearly. "That's my seat." Linda hummed under her breath and waved him through, but the damage was done. Every pair of eyes in the vicinity had locked onto him now. Every step Ethan took toward the jet bridge felt heavier than the last. His world, normally filled with complex equations, late-night brainstorming sessions, and big dreams, now felt impossibly small under the crushing weight of judgment. As he walked down the narrow passageway to the aircraft, Ethan couldn't help but notice the death nods and cold stares from the crew members waiting to welcome the first-class passengers, and whispered something to another, who stifled a laugh behind her manicured hand. He caught just a sliver of the comment. "Guess first class isn't what it used to be." Ethan swallowed hard and kept moving. He knew today was supposed to be monumental. It was the trip that would change everything. But right now, it just felt humiliating. As he stepped onto the plane, he forced himself to focus on the simple goal ahead. Get to his seat, stay invisible, and get through the flight. He found 2A easily, a window seat with plush leather upholstery and more legroom than he had ever seen in his life. He placed his battered backpack gently under the seat in front of him, then sat down and tried to make himself as small. Moments later, a tall, heavy-set man, Mr. Reynolds, slid into 2B, the seat next to Ethan. The man took one look at the boy, his face twisting in distaste. He called for the nearest flight attendant immediately. "There must be some mistake," Mr. Reynolds said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Ethan stared out the first class, not daycare. Ethan stared out the window, pretending not to hear, but every word stabbed deeper. Linda approached, the same tight smile on her face. "Sir," she cooed, "let me double-check your seating." She glanced at Ethan's boarding pass again, and barely hid her grimace. "Well, Mr. Reynolds, it seems everything is in order," she said. "He's supposed to be here." Mr. Reynolds grunted, clearly unconvinced, and muttered something under his breath about lowering standards. Ethan felt his ears burn, but he refused to let the tears prickling at the corners of his eyes fall. His mom always told him, "They can look down on you, but you never look down on yourself." He recited the words like a mantra in his mind. As boarding continued, more first-class passengers filed in. Some gave Ethan fleeting curious glances, some simply ignored him, but the vibe in the cabin was unmistakable. He did not belong, or at least, that's what they wanted him to believe. The final boarding announcement played overhead. The door to the plane closed with a soft thud, and the engines began their slow, powerful hum. Ethan adjusted the small blanket folded neatly on his seat. He pulled a worn notebook from his backpack, the same one he had filled with designs, ideas, dreams, and opened it to a blank page. His pen hovered above the paper, hesitating. What was supposed to be a triumphant moment now felt like a battlefield. He thought about all the nights he spent studying while other kids played video games, about the science fairs, the rejections, the breakthroughs, the quiet, stubborn belief that he could do something no one expected of him. He thought about today, about how this trip was just the beginning, not the end. And he smiled, just a little. Not because he was ignoring the cruelty around him, not because he was unaffected, but because he knew something they didn't. He knew that by the time this flight was over, every single person who looked down on him would have a very different story to tell. For now, though, he stayed quiet, blown into the leather and chrome surroundings of first class, his dreams tucked safely inside the pages of his notebook, waiting for the right moment to rise. Because Ethan Walker wasn't just a boy with a torn jacket and tired sneakers. He was a force of nature in the making, and soon, they would all see it for themselves. As the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway, Ethan kept his head down, pretending to read from his battered notebook while the low murmur of "Ethan sent" just beneath the surface. Linda Foster moved up and down the aisle with a clipboard clutched tightly in her manicured hands, pretending to review seat assignments, but in truth, her eyes kept flickering toward Ethan like a moth, unable to resist the lure of a flame. Finally, with a sharp click of her heels against the cabin floor, she marched directly to his seat, an artificial smile plastered across her face. "Excuse me, young man," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to perk up and listen. "I'm going to need to verify your ticket again. Please stand and wait in the aisle while we double-check the seating records." Ethan blinked, confusion tightening his chest. He had already shown his ticket at boarding, already sat through the subtle humiliation of being questioned once. Now this? He looked up at her, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "Ma'am, I already showed it at the gate and you scanned it." Linda's smile widened artificially, her voice dripping with false patience. "I understand, but we have protocols to maintain. Please cooperate." Around him, Ethan could feel the air thicken with judgment. He could hear Mr. Reynolds letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh, shifting uncomfortably, as if Ethan's very presence had become an inconvenience too great to bear. Ethan swallowed the rising lump in his throat, gently closed his notebook, and stood up as instructed, holding out his boarding pass like an offering. Linda took it between two fingers as if afraid it might somehow stain her, and scrutinized it far longer than necessary. She turned it over, checked the seat number, tapped on her tablet, and yet somehow still shook her head as if something didn't add up. "You'll need to stand aside for a moment while I clear this with the purser," she said briskly, pointing him toward the small empty space by the galley. Ethan obeyed without a word, the curious gazes of the other first-class passengers burning holes into his back. As he moved, he noticed one of the younger flight attendants, a woman named Karen, lingering suspiciously close to his seat. Karen, with her perfect bun and smirking lips, eyed his tattered backpack tucked neatly under the seat. She glanced around once, twice, ensuring that no one was paying her too much attention. Then, in one quick fluid motion, she nudged Ethan's bag out from under the seat with her foot, scooping it up under her arm as if it were just another piece of forgotten luggage. Linda, catching Karen's movements, hid a small laugh behind a cough. "Let's see what happens when the little genius realizes his stuff's missing," Karen whispered, her voice low but not low enough. "Maybe it'll teach him not to trespass where he doesn't belong." Linda chuckled back, a short, cruel sound. "If he throws a tantrum, we'll have the perfect excuse to move him back where he belongs." The two women exchanged a knowing glance, a silent agreement between conspirators. Ethan, standing near the galley, could only hear muffled voices and stifled laughter, but couldn't make out the words. Still, instinct told him something wasn't right. His fingers twitched at his sides, itching to check on his belongings, but he forced himself to stay still. One wrong move he knew, and they would, and a reason, to label him a problem, a reason to strip him of his dignity even further. Minutes dragged by, each second stretching taut like a wire about to snap. Linda made a show of consulting her tablet, pretending to scroll through seat assignments, while passengers began to grow restless. A few shot Ethan curious glances. Others didn't bother hiding their annoyance, tapping impatiently on their armrests or sighing audibly. Mr. Reynolds leaned over to a flight attendant and muttered something that made her nod and give a thin-lipped smile. The atmosphere inside the cabin grew colder, heavier, as if the very air conspired to squeeze Ethan out. Karen, meanwhile, sauntered toward the back of the plane, with Ethan's backpack tucked casually under her arm, disappearing through the curtain that separated first class from economy. She tossed the bag behind a storage bin with a set of touches of kilt, dusting her hands off as if wiping away any trace of guilt. Out of sight, out of mind, she murmured to herself, before returning to her duties. Linda finally approached Ethan again, her smile now almost triumphant. "There seems to be some confusion about your ticket, young man," she said. "Please stay here until we can sort it out." Her tone was so syrupy sweet it made Ethan's skin crawl. He knew it wasn't about confusion. It was about spectacle, about putting him on display like an unwanted trespasser, a living symbol of everything these people didn't want to see in their sanitized world of privilege. Ethan nodded mutely, jaw clenched, forcing down the mixture of anger and humiliation roiling in his chest. He thought about the countless times he'd sat through similar moments, school competitions, where judges questioned whether he had actually done the work himself, science fairs where people assumed he was part of a diversity initiative instead of acknowledging his genius. He thought about the scholarships he won, the hours he spent poring over textbooks and blueprints while others doubted his worth at every turn. And now, on what was supposed to be one of the proudest journeys of his young life, he found himself once again reduced to nothing more than an object of suspicion. In the background, the engines roared louder, signaling final preparations for takeoff, but Ethan stood frozen by the galley, clutching his notebook like a lifeline, refusing to give these people the satisfaction of seeing him falter. He would endure this. He would endure and outlast and overcome, just like he always had. Because while they saw a poor boy in a ragged jacket, Ethan Walker knew the truth of who he was, and very soon so would they. The engines vibrated softly beneath Ethan's feet as he stood motionless by the galley, clutching his notebook and pretending not to notice the sideways glances and low whispers filling the first-class cabin. Linda Foster moved through the aisle with a breezy air of authority, her heels tapping a steady rhythm that seemed to mock Ethan's quiet endurance. After several minutes of manufactured delay, she finally handed back Ethan's boarding pass with a falsely cheerful smile, telling him in a voice loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear that it appeared to be valid after all, a statement laced with the heavy implication that she still harbored doubts. Ethan gave a small nod, forcing a polite thank you from his lips, and returned to his seat, only to find that his backpack was missing. His stomach sank, but he said nothing. He would deal with that later. For now, the priority was to remain composed, to hold on to the slim shreds of dignity they had not yet stripped away. As he settled back into 2A, he unfolded his tray table and placed his notebook down, reopening it to a page filled with diagrams and notes. He forced his mind to return to the designs he had been working on, the concepts that had captured the attention of scientists far beyond this plane full of cynics, but concentration was fleeting under the smothering cloud of humiliation. Moments later, Linda appeared again, this time pushing the beverage cart with mechanical precision. Her smile was all teeth and no warmth as she began serving the first-class passengers their drinks, chatting amiably with those she deemed worthy of her attention. When she reached Ethan's row, her entire demeanor shifted, her smile thinned, her movements sharpened. Without so much as asking, she grabbed a plastic cup filled to the brim with water and placed it precariously on the lip of Ethan's tray table. With a deliberate motion, masked as a stumble, she accidentally knocked the cup, sending a cascade of icy water spilling directly onto Ethan's lap and across the open pages of his notebook. The chill hit him like a slap. He gasped involuntarily as the liquid soaked into his jeans and dripped onto the floor. Around him, a collective murmur rose from the other passengers, some gasping, others smirking behind their hands. Linda clucked her tongue in exaggerated disappointment. whipping a handful of paper napkins from her apron pocket and tossing them onto Ethan's tray. "You really need to learn how to keep your area clean like the other passengers," she scolded, her voice dripping with contempt, as if the spill were Ethan's fault. Ethan's hands shook slightly as he dabbed at his jeans, his soaked notebook forgotten for the moment, the words and sketches now bleeding together into a soggy, indecipherable mess. He could feel the heat rising to his cheeks, the knot tightening in his throat, but he pressed his lips into a thin line and said nothing. Reacting would only give them ammunition. Linda, seeing his restraint, narrowed her eyes slightly, as if disappointed that he hadn't risen to the bait. Mr. Reynolds, meanwhile, seized the moment to escalate the cruelty. He shifted dramatically in his seat, brushing imaginary droplets off his pristine slacks, with exaggerated motions before calling out loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "Excuse me, I did not pay for a first-class seat to sit next to this." His tone left no ambiguity as to what this meant. Ethan stared straight ahead, pretending he was somewhere else, anywhere else. Linda, emboldened by Mr. Reynolds' public declaration, leaned down conspiratorially and said, "If you'd like, sir, we can find you a more suitable seat." "I would appreciate that very much," Mr. Reynolds said, shooting Ethan a glare full of venom. "I don't intend to spend this flight cramped next to someone who clearly doesn't belong here." Ethan heard the words as if from a distance, his mind going strangely blank, his body locked in place. He dared look up. He didn't dare move. Within minutes, Linda had orchestrated the transfer with cheerful efficiency, ushering Mr. Reynolds to a vacant seat a few rows ahead, one that boasted even more legroom and amenities. Several passengers clapped politely as Reynolds walked past Ethan, as if congratulating him for removing an eyesore from their midst. Ethan remained rooted to his seat, drenched, humiliated, and utterly alone. No one offered him a dry towel. No one asked if he was okay. He was an island, adrift in a sea of privilege that had no place for someone like him. He stared at the water pooling on his tray table, the ruined sketches bleeding into meaningless blots of ink, and reminded himself, again and again, that this moment was not the end of his story. It was merely another test, one he would pass like all the others before it. But as Linda retreated down the aisle, a victorious tilt to her chin, Ethan knew deep down that the worst was yet to come. The cool dampness of his clothes clung uncomfortably to Ethan's skin as he quietly wiped the last puddles of water from his tray table, carefully folding the soggy napkins and tucking them out of sight. Around him, the first-class cabin had resumed its air of forced civility, though the occasional sideways glance reminded him that his presence remained a thorn in the side of many. Determined to salvage something from this degrading experience, Ethan pulled his laptop from the space beneath his seat. The absence of his backpack nagged at him like a splinter, but he pushed it aside for now. The thin, slightly battered device powered up with a soft whir, and Ethan immediately opened a series of complex schematic files, blueprints, and simulation models he had been refining for weeks. His fingers moved deftly across the keyboard, adjusting variables, running calculations, and sketching new concepts into the growing framework of a project that would, if successful, redefine energy efficiency in small satellite systems. But before he could sink fully into his work, a sharp, derisive laugh sliced through the low hum of the cabin. Linda Foster, standing near the galley with a group of her fellow flight attendants, tilted her head toward Ethan and smirked with exaggerated theatricality. "Ah, look," she said, her voice pitched high enough for surrounding passengers to catch every word. "He's probably just playing video games, dreaming about making it big one day." The mockery in her tone was so blatant that a ripple of snickering ran through the nearby rows. Ethan stiffened but kept his eyes locked on the screen, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Every instinct screamed at him to respond, to defend himself, to shout that he didn't need their approval because his work already spoke louder than their sneers ever could. But he had learned, through painful experience, that true power lay not in reaction but in silent, unstoppable progress. Still, the damage was done. The idea that he was just another deluded kid with a laptop and big dreams had been planted, fertilized by Linda's mockery, and watered by the disdain of those who wanted so desperately to believe they were better. As if on cue, a cluster of VIP passengers seated toward the center of the first-class cabin began whispering animatedly among themselves. Dressed in designer clothes, dripping in understated wealth, they epitomized the kind of gatekeeping elitism that Ethan had fought his whole life to overcome. Their conversation, though hushed, carried enough to reach Ethan's ears. Words like ridiculous, embarrassment, and what is the airline thinking floated through the air like poisonous fumes. One woman in particular, Ms. Amanda Carter, a prominent socialite known for her charity galas and carefully curated public image, seized the moment to deepen the humiliation. She pulled out her gleaming gold smartphone and, without any semblance of shame or discretion, angled it toward Ethan, stabbing several photos under the pretense of checking her messages. Ethan noticed the flash of the camera out of the corner of his eye but kept his face impassive, his focus glued to the rows of code and schematics before him. Ms. Carter tapped furiously on her screen for a few moments, then let out a high, tinkling laugh as she showed her phone to her seatmate. The screen displayed a freshly uploaded Instagram story, a blurry but unmistakable picture of Ethan hunched over his laptop, accompanied by a caption that read, "This is what first class has come to? Lowering standards?" Dream on, kid. Within seconds, the post began to garner likes and laughing emojis from her equally shallow followers, feeding the fire. A few rows ahead, Mr. Reynolds saw the post on his own phone, snorted loudly, and turned around briefly to glare at Ethan once more, his expression twisted in thinly veiled disgust. Across the aisle, a heavy-set man in a Rolex and monogrammed blazer leaned toward his wife and whispered something that made her burst into barely muffled giggles. Even the flight attendants, supposed arbiters of hospitality, exchanged knowing glances and smirks as they bustled through their duties. Ethan sat perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask, but inside, something old and familiar coiled tight within him, a burning, slow fury born not of hatred, but of a lifetime of having his worth questioned by those who lacked the imagination to see beyond his skin, his clothes, his quiet demeanor. They saw a poor black boy, tapping on a dusty laptop, and they assumed the rest failure, foolishness, and irrelevant. They had no idea they were mocking a mind that had already solved problems veteran engineers struggled with, that they were laughing at blueprints that top aerospace labs had fought to get a glimpse of. None of it mattered to them. All they saw was what they wanted to see. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the laptop, the only visible sign of the storm building inside him. He forced himself to breathe deeply, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way his mentor at the Science Institute had taught him during high-stress presentations. Not here, not now, he reminded himself. Let them talk, let them laugh. Every moment they spent underestimating him was another moment he would use to outpace them, another weapon he would forge into something they could never take away. Meanwhile, Linda continued her rounds, pausing every so often to cast disdainful glances in Ethan's direction, as if ensuring that her spectacle continued to hold the cabin's attention. Her laughter was quieter now, but it still lingered like a bitter perfume in the air, a constant reminder of the hierarchy she believed she was defending. And yet, despite it all, despite the cold wetness of his jeans, the ruined notebook, the stolen backpack, the biting derision from every corner of the cabin, Ethan's mind remained razor-sharp, slicing through equations and ideas with a clarity born not of spite, but of an unwavering belief in himself, a belief that no amount of mockery could ever diminish. The low hum of conversation in the first-class cabin buzzed faintly around Ethan as he continued to focus on his laptop, pretending not to hear the occasional snickers or catch the furtive glances darted in his direction. His fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, but the dryness in his throat grew unbearable, a physical irritation he could no longer ignore. He glanced up and pressed the call button discreetly, signaling for a flight attendant. A soft chime echoed in the cabin, and Ethan waited patiently, his posture straight, his eyes returning to the cascading rows of data on his screen. Minutes passed. He watched as Linda strolled up and down the aisle, attending to other passengers with syrupy smiles and prompt service, handing out drinks, adjusting blankets, all while conspicuously ignoring his life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a junior attendant named Claire approached with a hesitant smile that never quite reached her eyes. "What do you need, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but perfunctory. Ethan lifted his gaze politely and said, "Just a glass of water, please." Claire nodded without writing it down and disappeared toward the galley. Ethan returned to his work, the growing discomfort in his mouth a nagging reminder of how long he had already been waiting. 10 more minutes slipped by, then 15. His throat burned now, each swallow dry and scratchy. Other passengers who had requested refreshments after him were already sipping their beverages, clinking glasses lightly. The clatter of ice cubes a cruel contrast to his increasingly parched silence. He watched as Mr. Reynolds received a fresh scotch on the rocks with a flourish. As Ms. Carter was offered a sparkling wine, she waved away lazily, and as several others summoned the crew with the most casual flick of the wrist, and were met with eager attention. Finally, Claire reappeared, a glass of water in her hand. But there was no care in her movement, no courtesy in the way she approached his seat. Without so much as establishing eye contact, she extended the glass toward Ethan's tray table and dropped it with a careless thud, the water sloshing over the rim and wetting the already warped surface of his ruined notebook. Claire did not apologize. She did not even wait to see if he needed anything else. She turned on her heel and disappeared down the aisle, her posture rigid, her head high. Ethan stared at the lukewarm, half-spilled glass for a long moment, then picked it up carefully, sipping from it with mechanical precision, willing himself to absorb not just the water but the lesson it symbolized. You could do everything right, and they would still find a way to treat you like you were less. He set the glass down gingerly, pulling his soaked notebook aside to prevent further damage, and tried once more to anchor himself in his work, to lose himself in formulas and ideas that floated tantalizingly beyond the reach of this cruel reality. But the universe, it seemed, was not yet finished mocking him. Across the aisle, a small blonde-haired boy, no older than 6, sat perched on his booster seat, swinging his legs in boredom. His mother, engrossed in a fashion magazine, paid him little attention as he reached clumsily for the drink on his tray table. With a clumsy swipe, his hand knocked the cup over, sending a stream of apple juice splashing across the floor and onto the nearby seat. A noise, a startled yelp from the boy, a thud as the cup hit the carpet drew immediate attention. Within seconds, Linda was at their side, her entire demeanor transformed into one of maternal warmth and concern. She knelt beside the boy, her face lighting up in a bright, gentle smile. "Oh, sweetheart, it's okay," she cooed, pulling a handful of napkins from her apron and dabbing at the spill with swift, exaggerated motions. "No harm done, my love. Accidents happen." The boy sniffled once, but seeing Linda's cheery reaction, he giggled and buried his face in his mother's side. The mother barely looked up from her magazine, offering only a distracted, "Thanks," before returning to her glossy pages. Linda continued to fawn over the child for a few more moments, patting his hand reassuringly and gathering the now soggy napkins with a heroic air, as if she had just averted a disaster of monumental proportions. The contrast between how she had treated Ethan moments earlier and how she treated the little boy now was so glaring, so nauseatingly obvious, that Ethan felt a tight, burning sensation in his chest, a pressure that made it difficult to breathe. He forced himself to remain perfectly still, to keep his hands flat on his tray table, to keep his face blank. The lesson was clear. Mistakes were adorable when made by someone like him. In that single moment, more powerful than any shouted insult or sneering glance, Ethan saw the full architecture of the prejudice surrounding him, the invisible, unbreakable rules that governed who deserved kindness and who deserved contempt. He sat there, soaking in the reality he already knew too well, even as Linda rose to her feet, brushing her uniform free of invisible dust, her smile still lingering as she made her way back toward the galley. Other passengers chuckled softly at the scene, shaking their heads with indulgent amusement. "Kids," one man murmured fondly, "so cute." Ethan's hands curled into tight fists on the table before him, his knuckles whitening with the force of his restraint. "Not yet," he told himself. "Not yet." As Linda retreated back toward the galley, her saccharine laughter lingering in the air, like a foul aftertaste, Ethan sat perfectly still, willing himself to remain invisible, even as every nerve in his body screamed with the injustice he had just witnessed. His clothes were still damp, his notebook ruined, his dignity battered but not yet broken. Across the aisle, unnoticed by most, a young man in his mid-20s named Liam Brooks watched the entire scene unfold from behind a copy of the in-flight magazine he was pretending to read. Liam, dressed casually in jeans and a blazer, was not a first-class regular, but had been upgraded on this flight thanks to a frequent flyer perk. And unlike the others, he had seen the difference. seen the sneering indifference in Linda's voice, the gleeful cruelty in Ms. Carter's camera flash, and the way the atmosphere had congealed against Ethan like a silent conspiracy. His hands gripped the magazine tighter as he debated within himself whether to say something, to stand up and call it out, but fear rooted him to his seat. Fear of confrontation, fear of disrupting the carefully cultivated order of first class, fear of the sideways looks he would surely receive if he aligned himself with the boy everyone had already decided did not belong. Liam's conscience screamed, but his body betrayed him with stillness. He told himself it wasn't his place, that maybe things weren't as bad as they seemed, that maybe Ethan didn't want a scene made on his behalf. And so, he sat there in silence, an unwilling participant in a theater of cruelty he could not summon the courage to disrupt. Meanwhile, the final boarding announcements echoed through the cabin, the overhead bins clicked shut, and the flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, completing last-minute checks. The engines began their low, ominous rumble, a signal that the plane was preparing for takeoff. Linda returned to the front of the cabin, her clipboard tucked under one arm, her eyes scanning the rows with a predatory precision. Her gaze landed once again on Ethan, and her lips curled into a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. She exchanged a few whispered words with the lead flight attendant, a portly man named Dennis, who had been too busy managing logistics to notice or care about the brewing hostility in the cabin. Whatever Linda said, it was enough for Dennis to nod curtly and retreat back toward the galley. Taking that as her cue, Linda approached Ethan's seat with the same fake courtesy she had weaponized earlier. "Sir," she said, her voice artificially bright, "we've conducted a review of our seating assignments and we regret to inform you that there's been a mistake." Ethan looked up at her, his face a mask of polite confusion. "What kind of mistake?" he asked, his voice steady despite the exhaustion fraying the edges of his composure. Linda's smile tightened further. "It's about the overall branding and guest experience we promise in first class," she said, lowering her voice slightly as if sharing a confidence. "We aim for a certain consistency in our passenger image." Around them, a few heads subtly turned, passengers feigning disinterest but listening keenly, the way one watches a slow, inevitable car crash. Linda continued, her words slicing cleaner than any blade. "To maintain that standard, we're going to move you to a more appropriate seat in the economy section. You'll still have all your privileges, of course, but we must prioritize the harmony of our brand." For a split second, Ethan wondered if he had misheard her, if the absurdity of her words was some kind of sick joke. But the cold certainty in Linda's posture, the way she towered over him with smug authority, left no room for misunderstanding. The humiliation was surgical, calculated to extract maximum compliance with minimum resistance. Across the aisle, Liam Brooks felt his stomach knot painfully. He wanted to speak, to say this was wrong, that seating a paying first-class passenger elsewhere because of how they looked was discrimination at its ugliest, but still he said nothing. Fear, and the grim knowledge that speaking out in this rarefied space might see him ostracized too. Ethan sat still for a moment longer, letting Linda's words sink in fully, feeling the weight of every eye pressing down on him, the unspoken chorus of relief that would ripple through the cabin the moment he was gone. He closed his laptop with quiet finality and nodded once, his face revealing nothing, though inside, his heart pounded with a mix of rage and heartbreak so potent it almost made him dizzy. "May I have a moment to gather my things?" he asked quietly. Linda nodded, stepping back with a prim little smile of victory, her hands clasped neatly before her. Ethan bent to retrieve what little he had left, his laptop, his notebook, and realized with fresh dismay that his backpack was still missing, likely buried somewhere in the bowels of the plane, or worse, discarded without thought. He straightened slowly, balancing his laptop against his hip, and began the long, humiliating journey down the aisle, past the row of gleaming passengers who avoided his gaze or pretended he was invisible. Not one voice rose in protest, not one hand extended in solidarity. As he moved, the plane lurched slightly, the engines now roaring louder as they edged closer to the runway. The promise of flight so close and somewhere behind him, Liam Brooks lowered his magazine, his face pale, his conscience screaming, and still he did nothing. As Ethan made his slow, deliberate way down the aisle toward the looming economy section, his every step weighed down by humiliation and the thick, suffocating fog of judgment that clung to the air, he paused briefly near the galley where the curtain separated first class from the rest of the plane. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of his laptop, and for a moment it seemed as if he might simply continue forward, swallowing yet another injustice, as he had done so many times before. But something inside him shifted, a decision crystallizing with the cold precision of a blade drawn silently from its sheath. He set his laptop gently down on a service counter, then slipped his hand into the pocket of his damp jeans and withdrew a slim, battered smartphone. The screen flickered to life under his thumb, and with a few practiced swipes, he dialed a number from memory. Pressing the phone to his ear, Ethan turned slightly away from the gawking passengers and spoke in a voice so calm and composed that it cut through the ambient noise like a scalpel through silk. "Hello, Uncle Marcus," he said quietly, the name causing a ripple of confusion among the few flight attendants nearby who overheard. "I'm on flight 427, seat 2A. I'm having a small issue here. Could you please have someone verify my profile through the airline's internal system? Thank you, sir." There was a pause as he listened, his expression remaining serene, almost detached, before he ended the call with a simple, "Yes, I'll wait." Ethan pocketed the phone and picked up his laptop again, standing motionless by the galley with the quiet patience of someone who already knew the outcome long before anyone else did. Less than 2 minutes later, a subtle disturbance spread through the first-class cabin, a ripple of tension as a tall, broad-shouldered man in full pilot's uniform strode down the aisle with an urgency that immediately caught the attention of every passenger. Captain Robert Mitchell, a veteran pilot with 30 years of spotless service, wore a look on his face that was normally reserved for mid-air emergencies or catastrophic system failures. His complexion had turned an alarming shade of pale, and there was a tightness around his mouth that spoke of barely contained panic. The captain barely acknowledged the flight attendants who stiffened at his approach. His eyes were locked on Ethan, and the moment he reached him, he stopped abruptly, adjusted his cap in a rare gesture of deference, and bowed slightly at the waist, a gesture so shocking that even Mr. Reynolds turned around in his seat to gape openly. "Mr. Walker," Captain Mitchell said, his voice low but carrying enough weight that the entire first-class cabin fell into it. "On behalf of Skylex Airlines, I want to offer our deepest and sincerest apologies." He cleared his throat, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as he continued. "It is an extraordinary honor to have you aboard today. Ethan Walker, the National Young Inventor Award winner, recipient of the Presidential Science Medal, and current contributor to research initiatives at NASA and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, is one of the brightest minds of his generation." He turned to face the stunned, suddenly silent passengers, his voice rising slightly so all could hear. "We are privileged to have Mr. Walker on our flight today. Any mistreatment he has received is not only unacceptable, but an embarrassment to this airline and everything we stand for." The words hung heavily in the air, a heavy, suffocating blanket of shame that wrapped itself around every sneer, every whisper, every snap judgment that had been hurled at Ethan in the past hour. The transformation in the cabin was instantaneous. Linda Foster, who had been watching from a few rows back with a smug expression, turned a sickly shade of gray as the captain's words registered, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish gasping for air. Claire, the junior attendant who had sloppily dumped Ethan's water earlier, shrank back against the galley wall, her face a study in horror. Miss Carter's fingers hovered frozen over her phone, her most recent Instagram story still glowing mockingly on her screen, now a testament to her own ignorance and cruelty. Mr. Reynolds muttered a curse under his seat, avoiding Ethan's gaze as if the very act of looking might burn him. Captain Mitchell stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly once more so only Ethan could hear. "Sir, please, allow us to upgrade you to the private sky suite for the remainder of the flight. Complimentary, of course, and if there is anything at all we can do to rectify this situation, it will be done without hesitation." Ethan regarded him silently for a long moment, weighing his options, feeling the stares of every soul in the cabin, pressing against him like a physical force. Part of him wanted to reject the offer, to turn and walk away, to leave them stewing in the consequences of their own small-mindedness, but another, deeper, stronger part, recognized the moment for what it was. Not just personal vindication, but a lesson writ large across the faces of those who had judged him so harshly. With a calm nod, Ethan said simply, "Thank you, Captain. I'll stay here for now." The captain inclined his head once more, straightened his cap, and with a final look of profound regret, turned and strode back toward the cockpit. leaving a stunned, silent first-class cabin in his wake. Ethan returned to his seat, set his laptop carefully on the tray table, and reopened the sodden notebook, flipping to a fresh page. Around him, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending to read, others pretending to sleep, none able to meet his eyes. Across the aisle, Liam Brooks stared at Ethan with a complicated mixture of guilt, admiration, and something dangerously close to hope. The heavy silence that had descended upon the first-class cabin after Captain Mitchell's announcement was so absolute, it seemed to absorb even the hum of the engines, every passenger frozen in place as if fearing any movement might draw attention to their guilt. Mr. Reynolds shifted uneasily in his seat, his face drained of its earlier arrogance, now pale and slick with nervous sweat. His eyes darted toward Miss Carter, who sat rigidly upright, her knuckles white against the polished surface of her tray table where her phone lay face down, the mocking Instagram story already deleted but lingering in the memory of every soul who had seen it. They exchanged a quick, panicked glance, the universal expression of those who realized they had irrevocably crossed a line they could never uncross. Ethan, seated once again at 2A with his notebook open and laptop powered up, ignored them all, his posture relaxed. His focus seemingly returned to the sketches and diagrams that had once been dismissed so cruelly, but now shimmered with a significance no one could deny. Linda Foster, standing near the galley and clutching her clipboard like a shield, looked visibly rattled, the confident veneer she had worn so smugly now shattered into shards of exposed fear and regret. The humiliation of being publicly corrected by the captain, of seeing the tide of judgment turn, not against herself, had stripped her of all the performative professionalism she had so carefully cultivated. A sharp chime rang from the crew intercom, and Linda stiffened as Dennis, the lead flight attendant, emerged from behind the curtain separating the crew quarters from the main cabin. His face was grave, his jaw set in the hard lines of a man carrying out orders he knew could not be questioned. He strode toward Linda with deliberate slowness, stopping just a foot away from her trembling form. In a voice low but unmistakably firm, Dennis said, "Captain Mitchell has requested your immediate compliance. You are to draft a written report detailing your behavior toward passenger Ethan Walker during this flight and prepare to disembark upon landing at our next destination. Further administrative action will be taken pending review." The words hit Linda like a physical blow. She swayed slightly, her hand tightening reflexively around the clipboard until her knuckles turned white. Several passengers who had earlier laughed along with her now averted their gazes, unwilling to be associated with her impending downfall. A cold flush crept up Linda's neck, staining her cheeks a blotchy red as she opened her mouth to protest to offer, but one look at Dennis's unflinching expression robbed her of speech. The truth was undeniable, stamped into every sneer, every slight, every derisive glance she had thrown at Ethan, now weaponized against her by the very decorum she had once wielded like a sword. With trembling fingers, she retrieved a pen from her apron pocket and fumbled to unclip a stack of incident forms from her board. She bent her head and began to write, each stroke of the pen a reluctant confession, each word a silent admission that she had judged too harshly, treated too cruelly, and now deserved to face the consequences. Around her, the cabin remained locked in an unnatural quiet, every passenger hyper-aware of the drama unfolding yet too shamed to acknowledge it openly. Liam Brooks, still seated quietly across the aisle, watched the scene with a growing sense of grim satisfaction, mingled with residual guilt for his earlier cowardice. In the seat just ahead, Mr. Reynolds muttered a curse under his breath, his hand dragging nervously across his forehead, while Miss Carter retrieved her phone and stared blankly at it, her thumb hovering uselessly over the screen as if searching for a way to erase the indelible stain of her actions. Linda, her face set in a rictus of forced professionalism, finished scribbling her statement, signed it with a shaky flourish, and handed it wordlessly to Dennis, who scanned it briefly before tucking it into a folder without comment. She stood there for a moment longer, the clipboard clutched once again to her chest like a child's security blanket, her eyes darting nervously toward Ethan, who had not once looked up from his work, as if she no longer existed in his universe. Far too insignificance settled heavily on her shoulders. She, who had once wielded power so carelessly, was now invisible, irrelevant, judged, and discarded. It was a stunning reversal, a brutal reminder that the metrics by which she had measured others, their clothing, their appearance, their perceived worth had no bearing in a world where true value was defined not by surface gloss but by substance and achievement. The remaining flight attendants moved about their duties with exaggerated politeness now, offering drinks and snacks with mechanical smiles, their eyes darting toward Ethan as if desperate to distance themselves from Linda's disgrace. The atmosphere was suffocating, thick with the unspoken understanding that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably, that the silent pact of exclusion and derision had been shattered beyond repair. Ethan, for his part, continued to work, his laptop screen reflecting complex diagrams and streams of calculations that none of his fellow passengers could begin to understand. In that moment, he was untouchable, a force so far beyond their petty judgments that it was almost laughable. Linda took a single halting step backward, her shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor, then another, until she melted into the galley shadows, away from the burning spotlight of her disgrace. But the echoes of her downfall lingered, reverberating through the cabin with every strained cough, every nervous shuffle. As the plane touched down with a gentle jolt and taxied toward the gleaming terminal under a bright afternoon sun, the tension that had cocooned the first-class cabin did not dissipate as it usually did during a landing. Instead, it thickened, growing heavier with each passing second as passengers prepared to face the consequences of what had transpired in the thin air miles above the ground. The seatbelt signs chimed off, and Linda Foster, pale and subdued, remained rooted to her jump seat near the galley, her clipboard now lying abandoned on the counter behind her, a hollow symbol of authority stripped away. When the cabin doors opened with a mechanical hiss, Dennis was the first to step out. His jaw clenched as he summoned airport security discreetly with a few sharp words into his radio. Within moments, 2 uniformed officers boarded, exchanging clipped words with Dennis before leading Linda quietly off the plane. Her departure met not with applause or indignation, but with a heavy, awkward silence, the kind reserved for witnessing a public downfall so absolute that even the cruelest hearts could find no joy in it. Word of the incident spread faster than wildfire. By the time Ethan collected his laptop and meager belongings and exited the gate, snippets of video, secretly recorded by other passengers, had already begun surfacing online. Hastily uploaded clips capturing the moment Captain Mitchell had bowed respectfully to Ethan and condemned the mistreatment he suffered. Social media platforms ignited within hours, hashtags like Justice for Ethan and AS First Class Prejudice, trending globally as outraged users demanded accountability not only from Skylux Airlines, but from the individuals complicit in the discrimination. Within a single business day, Linda Foster's name became synonymous with corporate misconduct. Official statements from Skylux Airlines flooded the media, announcing her indefinite suspension pending a full internal review, though insiders confirmed she would likely never set foot aboard a company plane again. Her carefully curated career, built on the brittle scaffolding of superficial hospitality, collapsed into ruin as screenshots of passenger complaints corroborating past instances of similar behavior surfaced to further dismantle her reputation. Meanwhile, Ms. Carter, whose mocking Instagram story had served as an early catalyst for public outrage, faced a swift and brutal backlash of her own. Major sponsors of her lifestyle brand terminated partnerships within hours, issuing terse press releases denouncing any association with values incompatible with diversity, equality, and human decency. Her social media pages, once a curated parade of luxury and exclusivity, were flooded with furious comments, accusations, and boycott pledges, reducing her online presence from polished influencer to disgraced pariah overnight. Television hosts and news anchors dissected the scandal with glee, flashing her deleted posts across screens nationwide as a cautionary tale about the dangers of casual cruelty in a world where nothing stays hidden. Mr. Reynolds, however, suffered perhaps the most catastrophic blow. A prominent venture capitalist, whose clout in Silicon Valley had been unquestioned for decades, Reynolds prided himself on maintaining an image of progressive leadership and corporate responsibility, an image that shattered completely once footage of his loud complaints about the type of people allowed in first class circulated among business networks. Within 24 hours of landing, Reynolds' largest prospective client, a major tech startup poised to revolutionize renewable energy markets, withdrew from final negotiations, citing ethical concerns after their board of directors reviewed the viral footage. The deal, valued at over $20 million, evaporated through their mud, and prompting whispers about other clients reconsidering their affiliations. Investors pulled funding from projects tied to his name, citing risk exposure in an era where public relations disasters could cripple fortunes faster than bad earnings reports. His carefully built empire, like Linda's and Carter's reputations, began to collapse in on itself, leaving behind nothing but the sour taste of consequences long overdue. Meanwhile, Ethan Walker, oblivious to the storm he had inadvertently unleashed, continued through the terminal with the quiet dignity that had carried him through every slight, every sneer, every invisible weight society placed on shoulders like his. He boarded a sleek black car sent by the institute sponsoring his research trip, his laptop balanced carefully on his knees as he resumed work without missing a beat. News crews camped outside the terminal, desperate for a glimpse or a quote, but Ethan offered none, choosing instead to let his actions and the avalanche of justice now barreling down Montexits, now barreling down the mountainsides, speak louder than any words he could have uttered. Within days, Skylux Airlines launched a high-profile diversity and inclusion initiative in a desperate attempt to salvage public trust, partnering with advocacy groups and pledging sweeping reforms, though cynics questioned whether the effort stemmed from genuine contrition or mere survival instinct. For Ethan, none of it mattered much. His focus remained on the projects that had brought him here, on the future he intended to forge, not despite the obstacles thrown in his path but because of them. Across news networks and social platforms, thought leaders, scientists, and educators hailed Ethan as a symbol of resilience and excellence, a reminder that brilliance knows no uniform, no color. Parents showed their children Ethan's story as an example of how courage and composure could turn even the most entrenched systems of prejudice upside down. Liam Brooks, sitting alone in his apartment days later, watched the news coverage unfold with a heavy heart, grappling with the knowledge that he had witnessed injustice firsthand and said nothing. The shame burned brighter than any external judgment ever could, and deep within him, something began to stir. A resolve to do better, to be better, sparked by the quiet strength of a boy he had once ignored. Weeks turned into months, and the scandal that had erupted from Flight 427 began to settle into the archives of public memory. But for those most deeply affected, the events remained seared into their lives, an irreversible turning point that could not simply be forgotten or ignored. Linda Foster, once a figure of petty authority and silent cruelty, found herself isolated in ways she had never imagined possible. Job offers evaporated as soon as her name surfaced. Former colleagues cut ties without hesitation, and the carefully constructed social circles she had relied on for validation turned their backs without so much as a second glance. At first, Linda railed against the injustice, casting herself as a victim of public overreaction. But as the loneliness deepened and the reality of her new life took hold, something began to shift inside her, an uncomfortable awakening gnawing at the carefully constructed narrative she had built to shield herself from responsibility. In the small hours of the morning, staring at the cracked screen of her aging laptop in a dimly lit apartment she could barely afford, Linda composed a letter, not to salvage her reputation, but to unburden her soul. She'd published the letter openly, without a PR agent, without a lawyer to polish her words into something palatable. I judged someone by the color of his skin and the clothes he wore, not by his heart, his mind, or his worth, she wrote, her words raw and unadorned. I was wrong. I see that now more clearly than I ever have. No apology can undo the hurt I caused, but I offer it nonetheless, and I vow that moving forward, my actions, not my words, will be the measure of my regret. The letter spread rapidly across social media, not because it was perfectly crafted but because it was painfully real, a rare glimpse of genuine contrition in a world saturated with hollow apologies. Some were skeptical, as they had every right to be, but others saw in Linda's broken words the first fragile seeds of change, the possibility that even those who had done harm could learn, could grow, and could strive to make amends. At the same time, Ms. Amanda Carter, whose fall from grace had been every bit as swift and public as Linda's, underwent a transformation even more unexpected. In the privacy of her own shame, Amanda had reflected not just on the cruelty of her actions aboard Flight 427, but on the shallowness of a life spent chasing validation through wealth and appearances. The memory of Ethan Walker, quietly enduring humiliation with a dignity that eclipsed every luxury item she had ever possessed, haunted her in a way no amount of distraction could erase. Rather than retreat into bitterness or seek to rebuild her old life, Amanda chose a different path. One paved not with glamour but with purpose. Inspired by Ethan's strength and resilience, she liquidated a significant portion of her personal wealth and used it to establish the Walker Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing scholarships, mentorship, and resources to underprivileged youth pursuing careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. At the foundation's inaugural gala, Amanda stood before a crowd not of celebrities and socialites, but of students, educators, and community leaders, her voice steady and clear as she dedicated the organization's mission to the brilliant young minds whose light has too often been dimmed by prejudice and ignorance. In attendance that evening, by special invitation, was Ethan Walker himself, now a rising figure in both academic and public spheres, his contributions to aerospace technology already earning him accolades far beyond his years. When Amanda introduced him to the crowd, the standing ovation that followed was not merely for his intellect or his achievements, but for the quiet, unbreakable integrity he had displayed in the face of cruelty, a beacon that had guided others, even though toward their better selves. Ethan accepted the honor with his characteristic humility, speaking not of bitterness or vengeance, but of hope, resilience, and the belief that true progress was measured not by how far the privileged could rise, but by how fiercely they could lift others with them. Meanwhile, Liam Brooks, galvanized by his own guilt and Ethan's example, left his comfortable but empty corporate job and enrolled in law school, determined to become an advocate for civil rights and systemic change, vowing that he would never again allow fear to silence his conscience when it mattered most. Skylux Airlines, still struggling to rebuild its tarnished reputation, quietly funded initiatives supporting diversity in aviation and made Ethan Walker an honorary ambassador for their STEM outreach programs, a gesture that, while symbolic, signaled the beginning of a long, necessary reckoning within their ranks. Linda Foster volunteered time at local schools, speaking candidly to young people about bias, empathy, and the consequences of allowing prejudice to guide one's actions, her former life as a flight attendant a cautionary footnote in her journey toward redemption. Amanda Carter worked tirelessly alongside Ethan to expand the Walker Foundation's reach, traveling to underfunded schools across the country, sharing her own story not as a savior but as a warning of what unchecked privilege could blind one to. And Ethan, who had never sought revenge or validation from those who wronged him, continued to soar higher, his ideas pushing the boundaries of science and inspiring a generation that saw in him not just a symbol of excellence, but a living testament to the power of dignity, perseverance, and grace in the face of adversity. In the end, the story of Flight 427 did not become just another headline about outrage and downfall. It became a story about transformation, about the possibility of redemption, about the ripple effects of one young man's refusal to bow before injustice, and about a world inching, however slowly, towards something better. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Tell us in the comments which moment in Ethan's journey impacted you the most, and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you.